Is inauguration day for President-elect Donald Trump. The next 4 years will likely hold a political significance in our nation's history. Savannah Harrison spoke with a poli-sci expert about what we could expect in the next 4 years. Savannah, good morning.
Hey, good morning, Chad. Well, this presidency is already going to be a rare and unique one. The last and only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms was Grover Cleveland back in 1892. Now, for the next 4 years, what exactly is going to happen remains to be seen. Now, President-elect Trump running for a second term isn't necessarily a surprising choice, but it is rare. Previously, parties would typically pivot when a candidate lost after 1 term. However, the Republican Party held on to Trump even after his loss in 2020. Now, political science experts tell me they don't think Trump had to change that much to win this election. However, failures on behalf of the Democratic Party, such as ignoring Biden's supposed declining mental state as well as Kamala Harris's approval ratings, may have lost them this election. Now, what experts say will be interesting to follow is not only how the Republican Party springs from this win, but how the Democrats respond and change their party.
That's one of the interesting things always after an election is what the internal, sort of the navel gazing that the losing party does. So that's ongoing. And so now you have these conflicts, though, among Democrats. And so kind of the more centrist, moderate Democrats are blaming the left wing of the Democratic Party, the so-called wokeism or progressivism, and also the position on the border. Seeing which caucuses or which factions within the Democratic Party gain the upper hand. I would, yeah, it's a very stinging loss to lose to someone who was defeated 4 years ago.
Now, the exact historical significance of this move and of these political changes remains to be seen. Political science experts tell me it'll take several years before they fully understand exactly what all of this means in American politics. For now, reporting live in the newsroom, Savannah Harrison, KY3 News.